Hello, I'm Arik Korman, Communications Director at League of Education Voters. Welcome to our free online webinar series, Lunchtime LEVinars. We started this series 4 years ago to share information and build knowledge on important and timely issues. As the 2018-2019 school year gets underway, teacher salary discussions across Washington State are front and center. In today's webinar, Finances Behind Teacher Salary Negotiations, League of Education Voters Chief Advocacy Officer Kelly Munn will explain what teacher salary negotiations are and how they work, how teachers are paid, what a collective bargaining agreement is, also known as a CBA, how to find your school district's current teacher contract, and what happens when negotiations break down. She will also answer your questions along with Jacob Vela, League of Education Voters Senior Policy Analyst. Kelly Munn has been a dedicated education advocate for over 10 years. It's probably more than that, isn't it?
20.
20, okay. She moved from San Francisco 20 years ago to manage sales training at Microsoft. When her first child was 3, she decided to stay home with him, and in a few years, 2 more joined him. As her children entered the Issaquah school system, Kelly found it impossible to watch from the sidelines. She joined the PTSA and volunteered to work on a fundraiser for her children's school, where her ideas helped raise the income above the previous year's level. Although pleased with the results of her fundraising efforts, she quickly realized that the financial needs of the school went well beyond what they could raise at a walkathon. The Issaquah School District had repeatedly failed to pass its bond and levy, so Kelly became active in first supporting, then co-chairing the school bond and levy campaigns in her school district. Those campaigns were successful and brought much needed funding to the district. In addition to fundraising, Kelly also served as a legislative representative for her PTA. As she became more familiar with the inner mysteries of the legislature, Kelly began to see that to really make a difference, education advocates need to speak directly to the state. Working through her local PTA, Kelly helped education advocates in her community to better understand education funding and to find their voices so they could be heard by their legislature. Kelly's work with the PTA on the local, district, and state level has been honored with several Golden Acorns and the rarely awarded recognition as Outstanding Advocate in Washington State. Along the way, she also achieved the crystal level of leadership in the Washington State PTA's Leadership Academy. In her spare time, Kelly tap dances, shoots a mean game of pool, which I have yet to see, and has belonged to a book club for over 14 years. Jacob Vela's strong desire to get involved in the civic process led him to work in the election cycle in Nevada. That adventure compelled him to work as a legislative assistant in the Nevada legislature, where he focused on civic engagement and electoral issues. The strong civic culture and beautiful scenery of the Great Northwest managed to lure him away from Nevada. Prior to joining League of Education Voters, Jacob worked with local nonprofits in strategic planning and working to develop policies to improve the quality of life of formerly homeless individuals in downtown Seattle. Jacob received his BA in political science and Spanish from the University of Nevada. He earned his Master's of Public Administration from the University of Washington Evans School of Public Affairs, with a focus on policy analysis and urban policy. When not in the office, he can be found wandering the Cascades, enjoying Tacoma's parks, honing his skills as a home brewer, or watching terrible 90s action movies. He is also a huge Sounders fan. Got a couple of housekeeping items before we begin. First of all, you'll notice a Q&A function on the bottom of your screen. This is a space for you to pose a question to us. And as always, feel free to send any feedback about the webinar quality to us on the Q&A function or at info@educationvoters.org. Welcome, Kelly Munn and Jacob Vela.
Thank you, Arik. And thank you all for listening in. It's an honor to be able to talk to you about this issue. It isn't an easy conversation, and I do want it to be a conversation. So please type in your questions at any time. I will try to incorporate them, and I will make sure we have time at the end to try to answer, if not all, as many as we can. Again, this isn't an easy conversation. The districts believe they are doing what's right for kids. Staff believes what they are doing is right for kids. And this is about trade-offs. And they're tough trade-offs. Strikes are a breakdown in that system of some kind. They reflect frustrations with not adequate funding, and not the job and environment that the teachers and staff are hoping for. The goal today is to identify what just some of the problems are and how you can participate in advocating towards a better future. But before we do that, I just want to tell you a little bit about LEV's values around strikes. We believe that school disruptions have negative impacts on students and families. We want staff to be well compensated. And we want the students to receive the resources and supports they need. Those literally are the trade-offs that are happening. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about me. I have a personal experience with a strike. That's why I have a lot of interest and a lot of knowledge. About 10 to 13 years ago, my school district went on strike for 3.5 weeks. It was painful for everyone, for the teachers, the school board, the district administrators, the community. No one wants a strike, and the repercussions from a strike can go on for years. Every school district is different, but it can go on for years. There is a sense, there's a lack of respect or a sense of it and mistrust between many of those groups. In my case, 500 parents came out in support for our teachers. And that's likely happening everywhere across the state. We want to support our teachers, and we want them well compensated. I was one of the parents who supported our teachers, but I wasn't so sure about the strike because I already had figured out that we needed to lobby the legislators about better funding for our schools. And I wanted to turn people to where the problem was because I knew something that most of the 500 didn't know, and that was there was no more money. I'm going to repeat myself, there was no more money. Most community members did not understand that we couldn't raise anything else, that this was all we had. That program and staff would have to be cut, or we would give the staff salaries or not give the staff salaries. And all of those are trade-offs. The effects in my school district lasted for about 7 years. We had to make horrible choices about things to cut and the ripple effect of those cuts. I have been watching and supporting community members for years in helping them to better understand what is happening in a strike. It is frankly bewildering to us. I literally collected the material that I was getting from the admin and from the administration and from the teachers, and I sent it to the superintendent of our public schools and said, what the heck is going on? I can't even make sense of this. And the truth was, she said, this is the way it goes, and it never makes sense to the community. So today, we are trying to make it make just a little bit more sense. So I'm going to begin the conversation around funding and how this happened. The goal is to get you to ask questions of your school board and your legislators to fix these inherent problems with the existing funding system. So here's our agenda. What the heck is happening so that we have multiple strikes going on right now? Why are we seeing teacher strikes across the state? The trade-offs that are going to have to be made, and what you can do, some questions, and hopefully we get to resources. So what did happen? McCleary put a lot of money into the system, which is basically a lawsuit, and the legislatures have now abided by it. Money's gone in. Probably not enough. And for LEV, that money wasn't targeted enough to the students who need more. This year is a transition year. And what I mean by that is we've got two funding systems, and they're overlapping each other for 1 year, about 1.5 years. So you have the old system and the new system, which means we're getting bump in money. School districts will receive the old levy dollars and the new state dollars. This gives them extra money for this year. It appears that there is more in the budget. However, the amount a school district can ask their taxpayers will decrease in the next 1.5 years. So it's going to go back down because levies have decreased. There is a lack of clarity on where the money should go. How does the district divvy up the money? The district has multiple levels of teachers, staff, education assistants, nurses, counselors. In my school district alone, we have 9 unions. They have to divvy up this money that came in from a clearing, and in some cases, try to maintain the existing programs they have, or perhaps build new programs that will support the students. There's no clarity in where that money should have gone. So there is, because of that lack of clarity, it opens up questions in the system. It opens up conflict in the system. There's also confusion about the percent increases. Some people will say we need this percent or that percent, or increases in teachers in one school district getting a 16% increase, and in another school district they're getting a 20% increase. The state union's direction was to request up to 32% in staff increases across the state. Now, why that's difficult is every school district starts with a different amount of money. Let me repeat myself. Every school district starts with a different amount of money. And on top of that, they receive a different amount of money. So if we're asking for percentage increases, we're already creating some equity and at least equality problems. Because if I'm getting $100 and I get a 5% increase, I'm getting a $5 increase. But if I already have $200 to start and I get a 5% increase, I get $10 more. We've built, by using percentages, inequities that makes the school districts who have less have even less again in comparison to the school districts around them. And none of this was based on what a student needs. All of these things have created some of the problems we are facing today. So why are we seeing teacher strikes across the state? McCleary was not equitable. For Lev, what equity means is students who need more money, need more supports, need access and opportunity, didn't receive more. So it's not equitable. In fact, McCleary's not even equal. Everybody didn't receive the same amount. So I'm going to repeat myself. Each school district has some money, but it's not the same as the guy next to him. So they start not equal. And then the way the money was distributed out was not equal also. And yet, every teacher in this state deserves and is asking for money that they have earned and deserve. If they work in a school district that can afford a higher raise, more power to them. But what about the school district next to them? Those teachers work just as hard and they need it too. So we've got a problem. So this begins the tension between the school district and the staff. The staff want what they deserve, and the school districts are hampered by the different amounts of money they're all receiving. And I'm going to talk just briefly about some of that money. Some districts received more money for their experienced teachers. In other words, if they have a lot of teachers who've been teaching for 25 years, they got more money. But it didn't really completely flow out that way. In general, it flowed out that way, but not completely, which means we have inequity. In addition, there was regionalization money put out. Regionalization money is using the assumption that if you are in a high cost of living area, it's harder to get teachers. That assumption is not completely accurate. Although, say, Issaquah is in a high income area and and we have to pay teachers a fair amount and need to and should and do, rural areas also have trouble recruiting teachers for different reasons than Puget Sound has. So those regionalization dollars create inequities, because if it's supposed to solve hiring teachers, it doesn't quite work, because how do you handle the rural districts? So that created inequity across the state. Now so that's two of them, regionalization and experience factor. And the third one is some school districts can raise more money than others. There's a cap. You have caps on your local levies. This is not state money. This is the local money that you pay for with your property taxes. Some districts can raise $2,500 per student, and others can only raise $1,500 per student, and then there's some in between. Which means that some school districts are raising $1,000 per student more from their local levies than a guy conceivably, a school district conceivably right next door. And that is actually happening in the state of Washington. The state now distributes money to districts based on the property values. This means that the low property value districts, which tend to be districts with more students and family in poverty, therefore have higher needs for supports, are getting less money from the state. They are getting less money from the state. And those same property value districts are typically being capped at the lower $1,500 rate. So that's why we have an unequitable funding system. The school districts who receive a lot less than their neighbors are in a pickle. How do they keep their teachers but have less money to pay? How do they give the money to their teachers that they deserve and have less money to pay? They are not allowed to raise more money. I'm going to say it again. There is no more money. Each school district will have to decide this on an individual basis. They are going to have to make really hard trade-offs. Many school districts, the strikes are school districts that are struggling with the trade-off. Is it increase salaries, maintain existing programs? In at least a handful of school districts, they did not receive enough money from the state to maintain their current programs. So for those handful of school districts, they are stressed to the max. They can't give raises without making cuts. The pressure to be able to support their staff the same way as the school district next to them is enormous. I'm going to remind you that everyone has a different budget, a different pot of money, and on top of that, they have different schools and student needs. Some school districts will make the decision to pay staff and realize that the trade-off is making cuts to programs. Some school districts will try to not do that, knowing that the cuts may be to the kids who need it the most, or that the cuts could be pretty deep because they didn't receive as much money. Every school district will be different, and it's very hard for LEV to identify how it's going to happen in your community, which is what we're going to get to next. So here's what you can do. You need to ask questions. Let me just say that. Ask questions. Don't damage relationships because you're pissed. Ask questions. So here are some questions you could ask your school board members. Is this budget sustainable without making cuts? It might be. Everybody's different. That's our problem. But if cuts are needed, is there a public process? And is there a way you can give feedback? Or is there a survey? Is there a committee? And I'm going to encourage you to ask these questions, because those questions are a form of advocacy, and the community should be involved in the decision-making in where you go next if the cuts have to be deep. And again, not everywhere it will have to be. is different everywhere. You can also ask your legislators, how can we fix the inequities in the levy caps, right? We have inequities. And how can we advocate for funding based on student need rather than regionalization or other? How do we help those students who need the most supports? With that, I'm going to take this to questions. So I'm going to remind you to use the Q&A and send us some questions, and we will take as many as we can.
All right. Well, thank you, Kelly. I appreciate that. And we have Jacob Vela standing by to help answer any questions that need additional technical support. And I actually have one that came in that may need a little technical support. This came from, well, his name is Pat. Yeah, I think you might know him. He says, my Auburn School District board member told me that when the levy capacity transfer from school district to Washington State kicks in, the Auburn will lose $8 million in local levy collections. Does the sum of local school district levy transfer funding reductions reduce the $1 billion increased funding so widely characterized?
Jake, that one's for you.
That's a very good question. There were two major changes made in the last couple of years regarding education funding for the state of Washington. One, which many have heard about, was an additional infusion of money for education to meet the McClary decision to fully fund basic education. But that was also paired with the reduction in local levy authority. So they not only changed the system in which determines how much money each district can raise, but it also set a cap of roughly $2,500 per student as the most you could raise per student. And currently some districts raise up to $4,000 or more for per student levy funding. So there's a lot of districts that used to raise a substantial amount of money through the local levy system, which are now either capped at the $2,500 rate, or if they're lower income districts with lower average property values, their cap is actually at $1,500. So some districts are losing $2,000 or even $3,000 in funding per student through the local levy system. But an important part of that is that a lot of districts will be able to raise less money this current year than last year, but these levy changes actually don't take hold until this coming January of 2019. So it won't actually be till the 2019-2020 school year until the full financial implications of these levy changes are felt by school districts. So districts will actually have less levy funding in the 2019-2020 school year than this current school year, even though that the changes do begin this January.
Got it. Well, thank you very much, Jake. I appreciate that. If you have a question, and no question is too basic, just use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Here's one that is a little more basic. Kelly and Jacob, how do you find your school district's current teacher contract?
I will answer that. You can find the contract on your school district website. Jake, do you have any general directions you would find it? I know that in the past it's really, I have had difficulty finding it, and basically what I have done is called up my local teachers union and asked them where it is, which they were happy to tell me. But if you have more general specific information, that would be great, Jake.
No, that's generally worked for me as well. They're always on the website somewhere. Just might take some keyword searches in the website, and you should be able to track it down.
Okay, great. Thank you. So here's a question. What was the reasoning behind the two different levy cap levels?
Jake?
It's hard to say. I mean, I have some guesses, but it's hard to understand the exact reasoning behind the choices that were made. I think my guess is that they were trying to do two things. One, not limit what districts can raise locally, but at the same time limiting the maximum property tax that districts can levy. And the districts that are capped at the $1,500 level is because districts can raise no more than a levy that is equal to $1.50 per $1,000 of property value, which a lot of low-income districts can raise that full $1.50 and not raise a whole lot of money on a per student basis. But those higher income districts, especially in the Puget Sound area, can raise $2,500 per student in local levy funding with a relatively modest, comparatively, levy rate. So that's why there's the two different levy rates for the lower income to higher income districts.
Got it. And Jake, isn't it true that the lower levy rate if we raised it to $2,500, there's also state matching money that goes in called levy equalization dollars, and that there might be some, I mean, that's going to cost the state more, so some concern about that.
Correct. So for lower property value districts, the state has a program called Local Effort Assistance, or LEA, and what that does is it's supposed to help property poor districts make up for the fact that they have lower property values on average, so have to pass a lot higher levy rate to raise as much money as a higher income district. So the state comes on top of whatever the local districts raise if they qualify to provide additional support. But if you add LEA together and your local levy together, they can equal no more than $1,500 for the upcoming school year per student, which is, of course, $1,000 less than the other cap of $2,500 per student for higher property value districts.
All right, thank you, Jacob. Here's one, and then it actually follows right after what we were talking about here. Inequities in the system existed prior to the McCleary Compromise in how much money school districts were receiving when taking into account local levy dollars. With the state changing the system, would you argue the inequities are larger now or not as bad as it was?
Jake, can you go with that?
Yeah, it's hard to say on whether it's worse now or worse before. I think when it comes down to it, when you look at both the local levy limitations and how there's two different levels, as well as the main source of state funding is through staff salaries, and all that is impacted by regionalization factor, which is completely based on property wealth and not any other factors such as student need. There is significant inequities in the current system, so I can't speak to which one is worse, but I think it's pretty clear that the current system we do have is inequitable, that needs some more thoughtful student-centric approaches to direct money to where students need more supports.
All right, thank you. So here's a question. I have heard a great deal about what is owed to teachers, certificated staff, and hardly anything about what is owed to other school staff, like classified staff. Why is this?
That's a good question. I don't think I can completely answer it. From a state funding perspective, all staffing positions saw an increase in salary funding, from teachers to principals, district staff, as well as bus drivers, front office staff. So every employee in a school that is allocated to the prototypical school funding model for the state of Washington is going to receive more money for funding from the state this year than the previous year. So theoretically, it depends on existing salary levels, but other employees are just as entitled of salary increases on whether you're classified staff or certificated staff or administrative staff, of course.
Great, thank you. So here's we got probably 2 to 3 more minutes of questions because we're getting close to time, but there's wonderful questions coming in right now, so I really appreciate that. Again, it's the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Here's a question. Can you speak to the law around striking? I'm reading that the right to strike is not granted, but there are no actual penalties. So what can we expect if our district is currently experiencing a work stoppage?
I'll speak to that. The school district can file an injunction, or community members can file for an injunction, which means they have to stop, and that the court would put penalties into place if they don't stop. The truth is, at least to my recollection, and I've been tracking strikes for at least 15 years now, if an injunction is filed and there's penalties put into place, when an agreement is reached, the penalties are lifted. So there is no penalty to striking. I mean, except for the agony of the entire experience.
Thank you, Kelly. Does it make sense to begin to advocate for some sort of auditing process to follow the dollars to the classroom? We're not able to do this at this time.
That's a very good question. Starting in, I believe, 2 more years, the state will start tracking and reporting how money is spent in the district at the school level. So we'll have a better understanding of which schools are getting what amounts of money to kind of better understand both district level priorities and allocations of funding, but also how state level funding mechanisms may or may not influence the way districts allocate money within their schools within their districts. But as it currently stands, we don't have enough information, at least at a statewide level. There are some districts that decide to report those funding amounts to different schools in their districts, but that's not a common feature to my knowledge.
All right, thank you. A senior legislator told me prior to the summer of 2017 that they'd address McCleary's state must fully fund education and that they transfer levy capacity from local levy funding to the state to accomplish this. Can this be reasonably characterized as a shell game?
The mechanisms they used to create the necessary state funding was not as clear and direct as many people may have hoped. They did reduce local levy authority, so the local property tax rate that could be charged through local levies for schools, and in return they increased the state property tax. In all, they raised more additional money in the increase in state property tax than the reduction in local levy property taxes. So there was still a net investment as far as that goes, but it is not as substantial as one may think when you look at just the state property tax increase. There was a transfer of from the local to the state government as far as responsibility and credit for raising that money from the 2017 session.
All right, thank you. Got time for about 2 more questions. What would a student and student need focused funding approach look like?
I think there's, if you look at some other approaches in other states, it's putting a more substantial amount of money towards students who have shown to need more support, from academically struggling students, low-income students, ELL students. There's 2 student types, both homeless students as well as foster students that currently don't receive any categorical funding amounts from the state. But are huge investments from the district perspective to provide supports and services they need to really succeed in school. And even the funding that the state does provide for ELL students, for low-income students, and for special education. If you talk to a lot of the districts, both on the east and west side of the states, they don't feel that it's adequate enough to meet the needs of the students that they are serving. And if you kind of break it down into the more technical elements of the funding formulas, both for low-income students and for ELL students, the regionalization factor that each district gets, so basically it's related directly to the property values of that district, impacts how much they get on a per student basis for low-income students as well as the ELL students. So those districts with higher levels of regionalization factor from the state will get more money than perhaps a neighboring district with a lower regionalization factor, but a higher student poverty level or higher ELL population, for example. So even the student need formulas that we do have currently in the system, the technical aspects of those formulas aren't exactly equitable either, despite the fact that they're in existence to ideally be equitable.
So Jake, are you saying that because Issaquah has high property values, and Yakima's is lower, that for an English language learning student, Issaquah gets more money for that student than Yakima does.
Yeah, on a per student basis, Yakima, if they would have a lot higher ELS student population, which I believe they do, as well as a higher free and reduced price lunch enrollment for their student body, on a per student basis, Issaquah would get more than Yakima or a similarly situated district.
And that's just because of their property values.
That's all it is. That's because of the residential property values of that district.
All right, thank you. So Kelly, here's a question for you. What questions regarding education should we ask candidates for state legislative office?
That's very, very glad you asked that question. It depends on where you are on what the solution is, right? So you could ask for new revenue. You could ask for more guidance from the state on bargaining. For example, a community that's experiencing a strike, I referenced this earlier, is really, really confused. They do not understand what is happening, nor do they understand the choices that may be made, right? Even down the pike, you know, a couple years later when the cuts start occurring, and now they're mad because there's cuts. Not that they should or shouldn't be mad, but they should at least understand the consequences of how the funding system works. So they should be asking their legislators, they should be asking their school board first, what is our levy rate? And if it's not equal right now, then they should be asking for the $2,500. That's the first question I'd be asking right now. The second question I would ask is, there has to be a better way to fund education. And shouldn't it be based on the needs of a student? Shouldn't we be, instead of basing it on our property values, think about it, we're basing it on our property values. We need to base it on the needs of a student. So I would ask them, do they think property values are the values that they have for identifying how we fund education? And if you want more, you can just email me.
That's kelly@educationvoters.org. All right, the questions are so good. I hate to cut this off. Let's see, let's go with, how is the League of Education Voters working with teachers unions to share this information?
I would say we're not right now. We have in the past worked with the teachers union, particularly around raising funding. We've worked very closely, but sometimes we're at odds, and that's the way the organization, LEV is, right? We are advocating from our perspective for the students, and sometimes we're at odds sometimes with the school districts, we're at odds with sometimes the teachers, sometimes we're at odds with certain communities. It is the nature of standing up and saying what you believe and asking for it. So right now, we're not working as much with the teachers union. If you were to ask me, I would like to.
Thank you, Kelly. And last one, can the currently negotiated salary increases that we're seeing across the state be sustained?
That's a very good question. And I can't make any kind of blanket statements. I think you have to look at each individual district, because every district had a different starting point from how much funding they got, and different districts got different amounts of new money. So it's impossible for me to say whether or not broadly they can be sustained or not sustained. I think some districts have come out and said that these aren't sustainable, and in a year or two they may be required to lay off staff, while others have been able to come to an accord with that is able to both maintain a budget reserve in case financial difficulties may happen down the line, while still being a sustainable budget. So obviously it can be done, it has been done, but there are some situations across the state where the sustainability of the agreement is up in the air, as put forward by district representatives.
Thank you, Jacob. Kelly, do you have anything to add?
I do have something to add, and that is a great question to ask your school district. Then you'll know. And then if it's not sustainable, then ask your school district how this happened. Not that they have given more money to staff, because they made a choice, right? It's not about that. It is about what happened to the funding? Is there additional dollars that you're not getting? And you should probably start asking for them.
On that note, thank you, Kelly Munn and Jacob Vela. Thank you so much for the great information. Thanks to you for submitting such fantastic questions. I really appreciate that. And we look forward to seeing you in our next webinar. We don't have a topic scheduled yet, but once we do, we will definitely notify you. We appreciate you joining today. If you have any additional questions or comments, please send them to kelly@educationvoters.org. A recording of today's presentation will be available on our website, educationvoters.org. Please feel free to share with your friends and colleagues. Thank you again for attending, and we hope that you will join us at future webinars.